events that we're currently running here in Canberra. My name is Sean Press. I run these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association and do a daily summary on the day after that the event has taken place. So last night the ACT Chess Association held its second rapid event since we've been shut down, and we had a good field of, I'm going to say, around about 30, 25 players. And again, once again, it was very closely contested. It was first place was won by Malik Amir with 6 out of 7. We ran it as a 7-round event with a time limit of 10 minutes flat, just to squeeze in a couple of extra rounds. But we are, of course, trying to work out our nice little balance there between time controls and some people like the 2-second increment, and some people prefer sort of the more rounds, and we're just trying to find a balance on that one as well. So Malik Amir came first. In second place was Harry Johnson, and in third place was candidate master Wei Li. The game that I am looking at now, though, comes from further down, and it was played between Andrew Dempster and Paul Campbell. And going through this game, the one thing that struck me was this is a very good example of how to exploit pawn structure and pawn weaknesses. So we'll get started. Andrew Dempster is white, started with e4 Sicilian, and played a delayed c3, a delayed Alapin here. This has some benefits, others not necessarily so sure. And black played knight c6. Now, there are a couple of dirty tricks in this opening, even as early as move 3. Knight f6 is one good move for black. After bishop b5, knight to c6, d3. White is pretty comfortable in this position, but then again, so is black. The sneaky trick is a little move like bishop e2 here, hoping for knight takes e4 when queen a4 check attacks the king and takes the knight on e4, winning a piece. So, but if black doesn't fall for that trick, white eventually has to play something like d3 anyway. And whether the bishop's well placed on e2, I'm not 100% sure. So we go back to knight c6. So we play d4, and this is the whole point behind playing c3 early, is when you play d4, if your opponent decides to capture on d4 with their pawn, you can capture straight back with yours and keep your 2 pawns in the center. Knight f6 got played now, and Andrew Dempster very quickly decided to go for a queenless middle game. After d takes c5, d takes c5, there's going to be a swap of queens. If you don't want to swap queens in exactly this way, knight takes e4 can be played, but after c takes d6, queen takes, knight takes, queens have come off. The only difference, well, not difference, I suppose, but the one thing pointing out of importance here, and this applies to a lot of the c3 Sicilian systems, is the relationship between the pawn on c3 and the knight on b1. It just gets in the road. And while it's great if you get to capture back on d4, if it's stuck on c3, then it's not such a good place for the pawn, because the knight does struggle to come out. And we'll see a little bit of that later. So he took, and the queens came off, taking with the knight rather than losing the rights to castle with the king takes. Bishop check, knight comes back here. We could have just gone for the broken pawn structure straight away with bishop takes c6, and after doubling the pawns, developing the knight via d2. And then while I was analysing this game, the computer threw in this slightly weird g5 suggestion here, the idea being to drive the knight away on f3, but if we take, then rook g8 just lines up the knight and the pawn, and when the knight moves, we can take on g2. Sometimes you can get away with these little tactics. Often they're better learnt than calculated, but if you know it works, you can always try it. So we've got e5 here, pushing away the knight, and it turns out that probably the first really big strategic error in this game came on this move. The knight retreated to g8. It really needed to go forward to d5 because centralized knights are good. And it turned out that the knight on g8 caused a lot of problems for black. After castles, for example, bishop f5 here. And we can see the problem with the pawn on c3 and the 2 minor pieces that I've highlighted on b1 and c1. That The bishop doesn't really have too many great squares to go to along this diagonal, all the way along here, because it'll get swapped on most of them, or captured, or driven away. And if it goes to d2, then it gets in the road of the knight, who also wants to go to d2. So the knight comes first. After e6, the position's pretty equal. Here, black should be happy with this position. In fact, I'd be slightly happier to be black here rather than white. But the knight went back, bishop took, so we've now got double pawns. And the problem with the double pawns, of course, is they can't protect each other. And bishop e3 starts to already show the problem that with a pawn on b7, it can go to b6, but with a pawn on c6, it can't protect the pawn on c5. And e6 was played, but even if you try and get active with something like bishop g4, bishop takes c5, bishop takes f3, g takes f, e6 here, you've kind of, you've still got the same issues. You're down a pawn in this case. I mean, I suppose that you might decide that the c5 pawn was useless anyway, and it's worth getting rid of in return for damaging white's f pawns, but not really. You're still down a pawn. So e6 was played, and then c4 came the response here, possibly because white wanted to bring the knight to c3, as well as not allowing the pawn on c5 to run to c4. Could play knight bd2, same principle, stopping the pawn from moving forward. Bishop a6 here, but knight e4 is a very nice square for the knight. We're now attacking the pawn twice. You can try and castle, but again, we're giving away a pawn in these lines. And so this keeps showing you that the problem with these c-pawns, once they're doubled, they become targets. So it's good strategy from white to start bringing out the pieces and piling up on it. Knight goes to e7 to develop, and we're essentially giving away the pawn for free. Could go to h6, knight to h6, but again, bishop takes, g takes, and we get this kind of interesting position where black has horrible pawns, c5, c6, and h6, h7. But they do have the two bishops, and potentially the two bishops can count for something. But there is an advantage here, I think, for white, and not a huge advantage, but certainly a better advantage. Because white's plans, especially with queens off the board, isn't about things like checkmating. White's plans is just about hoovering up stray pawns and then going into an ending. And this happened in the game anyway. Bishop takes c5. Knight went to f5. We took down on f8. King takes f8 again is a slightly dubious move. Rook takes instead is slightly better because the king needs to stay closer to the center. It kind of was, but there's also some options about castling queenside under these circumstances. We could play g4 for white to push the knight back. Knight c3, and again, in a reverse of the tactic that I showed you earlier, we can leave the pawn on g4 because if knight takes here, then rook g1, and suddenly the black knight has to move, and the black g7 pawn goes instead. So we took here. Okay, castles now. Pawn to c5 again. In theory, because it now leaves the bishop with more squares to move to than when the pawn's on c6. King e7 coming to the center was your other choice. So knight now comes to c3. Bishop comes out, but we're easily defending our pawns here. King now moves towards the center. So the next few moves seem quite sensible. e4 is also an option, and in fact happens later. And the idea is the knight on e4 gangs up on the d6 square, which we're going to find out is really important soon, and the c5 pawn. So rook went to f to d1. So we're now arguing over the file here. There is a tendency when you're in a position where you are ahead material, in this case white is ahead by a pawn, to just exchange everything off and head for an ending. There is a risk in this strategy that not all endings a pawn up are going to be winning for you. But what it does mean when you're material ahead, and this is really important, I think, is that the person who is down material actually probably avoids more exchanges than they normally would. And the reason is the closer you get to the ending, the more likely it is, it's not guaranteed, but the more likely it is that the player with the extra pawn is going to win. So players who are down material, in this case a pawn, have a stronger case for keeping pieces on the board. And in doing so, you can take advantage of that by simply letting your opponent make the exchanges rather than you, while you put your pieces on good squares. The antidote for pieces on good squares is to swap them off. But if you've tied one arm behind your opponent's back that they don't want to swap off, then you get away with it much more. Nonetheless, so knight a4 was fine here because this pawn is now very difficult / impossible to defend. Because if one of the rooks, if the A rook comes across, you can just start swapping and then take control of the D file. And if the the D rook moves to the C8, then you've got control of the D file as well. So that white took, black took, and then white continued the strategy of I'm going to swap things off. And at which point, black sensibly said, well, I'll avoid that for now by blocking the D file here. But white's still following this, I'm going to get everything off the board strategy, and played knight takes D4. C takes D4 was played. Okay, if rook takes D4, rook takes, pawn takes, knight B5 actually does show you how this position can be winning for white. We are threatening to take the pawn on A7. We are threatening to take the pawn on D4. D3 is probably the best go for black here. But imagine we take instead and we get to a purely king and pawn ending. The two pawns, the one on B5 and the one on E5, cover these two squares that I've marked in red so that the king can't come in as easily. And so black might play F6 here to try and chase one of those pawns away. But after F4, white is easily winning. The king is just going to march across the board in this direction and capture this pawn here on E4. Whichever colour I give it. On D4, I should say. And a pretty simple win from now. Taking here is not the best move, but it turns out that white probably can get away with it as well. But it does show that after G takes, then the D6 square is free. So king F1, king up, king up, king up. Now I'll just show you a little trick here. This is not the best line for both sides, by the way, but I'm going to show you just a little trick to pay attention. Here, E5 to defend, we play king here. And if black gets greedy in this position, thinking it's going to clean up some pawns, white can always play a move like G4 to stop the kingside pawns marching up. And if black grabs the B3 pawn, then suddenly A5 is winning. Because after king B4, B6, and we can't stop the pawn, so the pawn runs. So you've got to be very careful when you march your king too far up the board in king and pawn endings that it doesn't get left behind. Then anyway, back to this position here, C takes instead of rook takes, and the knight goes to E4. And then it's going to go to D6 in some lines, and other lines as well. F6 gets played, and of course F4, as we saw in the previous note. And the idea is you want to recapture on E5. You love that pawn on E5 because it controls so many good squares. So the bishop hopped back to threaten the knight, and of course the knight now went to D6. It's threatening the bishop on B7. It's blocked the D file. The pawn on D4 is now a massive weakness. Takes. Now, black could have got away with just taking the free piece. And after rook up, knight here, knight here, white is easily winning this position a piece ahead. But took instead. This doesn't ruin white's winning chances here, by the way. And the bishop's still under attack. The pawn on D4 is still liable to be captured. So the bishop went to C6, and then rook takes D4. And we're suddenly just, white is just 2 pawns ahead now. And it's just a matter of converting this ending. And it's a pretty easy ending to convert, but I have seen people muck around a little bit, not quite getting the right plan. The goal is just to march the queenside pawns up in this case. The knight on D6 is doing a fantastic job of covering lots of important squares. There is one sneaky, annoying try and checkmate trick in this position involving rook F4, rook F7. Here and then here, because that is a checkmate if you can pull that one off. But that's not what's going to happen. Nonetheless, black probably decided to head that one off at the pass with rook F8 straight away. So now we just start marching the pawns. B4, the idea is to play B5, B6. So A6 to stop that, but it didn't really because we just moved the pawn, and after taking and taking, and see how great that knight is on D6. It's covering B5, and it's covering B7, and it's covering C8, and it's covering a whole lot of things here. So the bishop went to D5, and then we just played A4. And now this game's pretty straightforward from here on in. You've just got to make sure you don't play anything too ridiculous, and it's almost automatically winning. So the rook came across. Even if the king tries to come over after b6, all those squares in red are now out of bounds for the king. So the king moving across really didn't help. Rook to a8, and the pawn marches on. Bishop drops back to c6 for, well, there's probably not much here in the position. We play b7. Of course, black could just surrender the bishop at this point, but it's not really going to help after here. That pawn's still going to come charging through. The king's still cut off from the king side, queen side, stopping the pawn, and white, at his leisure, can just march the king up to the center of the board and then continue with a winning plan, including, in some lines, just rook d7, swapping off rooks, and then winning that ending as well. So the rook went to b8 to get in behind the pawn. The rook comes across to defend, of course, so that the bishop doesn't take. King across now, but then after a5, king here, a6, it's all over. a7 is going to get the board, and that rook's going to come off at a minimum. Even if rook takes b7 after a7, you take with the knight, of course, and you're up the exchange, and you still have the winning a7 pawn hanging around. So that was a nice win for Andrew Dempster. Good technique pretty much all the way through. Black didn't make any huge blunders, but just created a weak position. Knight g8 was probably a strategic blunder, but it was just taking advantage of things like double pawns that really worked in white's favour there. So that came from last night's ACTCA Rapid Play tournament, played with a time limit of 10 minutes each. The ACT Chess Association organised lots of these events now while we're in lockdown here in Canberra, and we'll continue to do so until lockdown is being lifted. We're not sure when. If you are a local Canberra player, want to take part in these events, just get onto Lichess, try and find the ACTCA Fast Chess Club, apply to join, but please make sure you list your full name and the club that you play at, or the ACT chess activity you're involved in, whether it's schools chess, junior chess, club chess, or street chess. Because at the moment, every time I start a tournament, I get bombarded with last-minute requests from people who probably don't live anywhere near Canberra, and I have to keep rejecting them as well. But it's for Canberra people and Canberra-connected people to take part. So thanks for tuning in. My name's Sean Press. I do these summaries the day after, normally at 10 a.m. Canberra time, after the event. And I look forward to seeing you on Friday.